We like to think America keeps moving, always building, always reinventing, always upgrading to whatever comes next. But that's not entirely true, because scattered across this country, from the Texas desert to the mountains of Arizona, there are towns where the 1960s never actually ended. Not abandoned, not theme parks, not fake vintage aesthetics dressed up for Instagram, just real places, still running on the same rhythms, the same streets, the same logic they had 60 years ago. Here's the part that gets strange. Some of these towns didn't fall behind. They made a choice. Or the choice was made for them. Either way, what they kept might be what everyone else already burned through. What the textbook skipped is this: progress isn't always what shows up. Sometimes it's what leaves. And the towns that didn't chase it, they're still here, exactly where you left them. So today, we're breaking down 10 American towns that got frozen in the 1960s and somehow never had to thaw. No nostalgia tours, no curated charm, just the real places where the past didn't leave. Like the video if part of you is curious about a slower life, but not committed enough to give up Wi-Fi. Subscribe, because where you end up isn't always planned. Sometimes it's just where you stopped running. Let's get into it. Number 10. Bees Bay. There's a town in southeastern Arizona that copper built, hippies saved, and time simply forgot to finish. Bisbee doesn't look like America in 2025. It looks like America in 1967, the year after the mines started dying, and artists started arriving because rent had completely collapsed. Population around 5,000 people. Median home price floating between $200,000 and $250,000. Remarkable for a town perched at 5,400 feet in the Mule Mountains. Rent, if you find a place, roughly $850 to $1,100. Crime rate, low. Cost of living, noticeably below national average. On paper, it sounds manageable. But then you actually arrive. The streets don't run in a grid. They don't run in any logical pattern at all. They climb the canyon walls in narrow switchbacks with staircases instead of sidewalks. Victorian buildings stacked on top of each other like someone built upward because there was nowhere left to go sideways. The town is essentially an architectural accident that became a personality. Here's what happened. Bisbee was once the largest city between St. Louis and San Francisco. At its peak, 1910 to 1920, over 9,000 people lived here on the back of the Copper Queen mine. Then the copper ran out. By 1950, more than 60% of the population had evaporated. The real estate market collapsed completely. And what the textbook skipped is what happened next. Cheap housing in a beautiful climate in a remote canyon doesn't disappear quietly. It gets discovered. In the 1960s, artists and counterculture figures flooded in, not to renovate, just to stay. The buildings they moved into are mostly the same buildings still standing today. The mines officially closed in 1975. But by then, Bisbee had already reinvented itself, not into something new, into something preserved. Living here is genuinely cheap by Arizona standards, but the trade-offs are real. Limited job market, serious healthcare access issues. The nearest major hospital is nearly 100 miles away, and an isolation that feels romantic until you've driven the same winding mountain road for the 4th time in a week. One longtime resident put it this way: Bisbee is where people come when they're done explaining themselves. And that sounds like freedom, until you realize it also means nothing much changes here, by design, by habit, by the weight of a canyon that doesn't make room for reinvention. This isn't a town that froze in the 60s by accident. The counterculture arrived, looked around and said, yeah, this works exactly as it is. Number 9. Granville. Most people drive through Tennessee and completely miss it. That's not an accident. Granville doesn't advertise. It doesn't have to. Population, under 400 people. Median home price somewhere in the range of $180,000 to $220,000. Rent, if you can find a long-term rental, is one of the lowest you'll encounter anywhere in the country, frequently under $800. Cost of living sits roughly 25 to 30% below the national average. The numbers look like a mistake. They're not. Granville sits on the Cumberland River in Jackson County, Tennessee, a region that the interstate highway system simply routed around. That single decision, made in the 1950s and finalized in the 60s, is arguably why this town looks the way it does today. When the highway bypassed you, the chain stores didn't follow, and the franchises didn't arrive. The redevelopment money went somewhere else. What stayed was the hardware store, the diner serving country ham and biscuits at 6 a.m., the post office as the actual center of community life, and the buildings, 19th and early 20th century storefronts that were never torn down, never renovated, just kept running. But then walk the main street, and you notice something that's harder to explain than the architecture. There's a stillness here that isn't quiet. It's thick, like the town has been on the same page for decades and isn't in a hurry to turn it. What the textbook skipped about places like Granville is that bypassed doesn't mean forgotten by the people still living there. It means forgotten by everyone else. And for a lot of the families who've been here for 4 or 5 generations, that distinction matters enormously. They didn't get left behind. The rest of the country just stopped looking this way. Limited opportunities if you're young and ambitious. That's the honest part. The job market is local, small, and not growing. Healthcare requires a drive. Career growth requires a different kind of math than most people in 2025 are willing to do. One local reportedly said, "People here don't retire. They just slow down a little more each decade until one day they're exactly where they always were." That's either peace or stagnation, depending on what you needed when you arrived. Granville didn't freeze in the 60s, the highway froze it, and the town decided that wasn't the worst outcome possible. Number 8. Lincoln. There are towns that feel like history, and then there are towns that feel like history never actually finished happening. Like the argument got paused mid-sentence and everyone's still waiting to see who's going to speak next. Lincoln, New Mexico is the second kind. Population under 60 people. Median home price in the range of $200,000 to $300,000, depending heavily on what's available. And availability is the real issue because not much changes hands here. Rent is largely non-existent as a formal market. Cost of living is low if you're already embedded. Jobs. This is not a job market. This is a historical site with people living in it. Lincoln is a National Historic Landmark. The entire town is the landmark. Every building on the main road, the old courthouse, the former store, the adobe structures lining both sides of a single dirt-adjacent street, is protected. Some of them are approaching 150 years old. But the reason Lincoln ended up on this list isn't the buildings. It's what happened here in 1878, the Lincoln County War, a cattle and land dispute that escalated into one of the most documented gunfights in frontier history and produced a figure named Billy the Kid, who became America's most mythologized outlaw, largely because of events that took place on this specific street. What the textbook skipped is that the mythology never left town. It compressed into the buildings and the silence and the way the light hits the dust on the main road in the afternoon, and it has been sitting there ever since. The 1960s didn't freeze Lincoln. Lincoln froze itself sometime in the 1880s, and the 1960s just went along with it. Living here is not for everyone. It is genuinely remote. The nearest grocery store is a real drive. Healthcare is ruidoso, nearly 40 minutes away on mountain roads. There is no cell signal on much of the property. There is no noise except wind and the occasional tourist. One person who moved here from Albuquerque described it simply, "I thought I was buying land. Turned out I was buying quiet." Some people last. Some people realize pretty quickly that this level of preservation comes with an equal level of isolation, and they drive back the way they came. Lincoln isn't frozen in the 1960s. Hey, it's frozen in 1878, and the 1960s just stayed to keep it company. Number 7. Eureka Springs. This might be the only town on this list where the Victorian era and the Summer of Love arrived at the same moment and somehow both decided to stay. Eureka Springs is physically impossible. It was built on and into the Ozark Mountains in the 1880s. Streets that don't intersect on a flat plane, buildings that have their first floors on one street and their fourth floors on another. No two addresses that approach each other in any recognizable order. The town was designed by geography, not architects. And in the 1960s, when artists and counterculture figures started arriving and seeing the cheap, ornate Victorian buildings cascading down the hillsides, they didn't modernize what they found. They decorated it. Population, around 2,000 people. Median home price, roughly $250,000 to $350,000. Higher than you'd expect given the remoteness, because the aesthetic has been discovered. Rent around $900 to $1,200 depending on elevation, which is a real factor here. Cost of living below national average. Crime, low. Tourism is the economy. Arts, crafts, live music, quirky small business culture, and a genuinely intense local pride in being the strangest town in Arkansas, which is saying something. But then there's the thing about Eureka Springs that the numbers don't capture. This town has been openly weird since 1879 and has committed to that position without interruption. The healing springs that gave it its name didn't save it economically, but the reputation for being the place where the unusual was welcome, that reputation kept people coming. What the textbook skipped is that Eureka Springs preserved itself not by protecting its history, but by protecting its permission to be different. The 1960s counterculture didn't change the town's DNA, it confirmed it, limited traditional job market. If you're not in tourism, hospitality, or running your own small business, the options narrow quickly. The mountain roads that make it beautiful also make it inconvenient in winter. Healthcare is a serious drive away. One local business owner put it this way: everybody who stays here had somewhere more sensible to be and chose this instead. Eureka Springs didn't freeze in the 60s. It doubled down on itself in the 60s, and everything since has just been maintenance. Number 6. Luckenbach. If you want to understand what it looks like when a town gets down to its absolute minimum and then somehow becomes famous for it, Luckenbach, Texas is your case study. Population 3. That is not a typo. Official permanent population of 3 people. Land area, about 9 acres. Physical structures, a dance hall, a general store that's now a saloon and souvenir shop, and a scattering of picnic tables under pecan trees. That's it. That's the whole town. And yet, hundreds of thousands of people make a deliberate pilgrimage here every year. Here's what happened. Luckenbach was founded by German immigrants in the Hill Country in the mid-1800s as a trading post. It grew to a population of 492 by 1904. Then roads got better, cities got bigger, and by the 1960s, Luckenbach had essentially become a ghost town with memories and a general store. In 1971, a rancher and local character named Hondo Crouch bought the entire town for $30,000, declared himself mayor, declared Luckenbach a free state of mind, started hosting festivals and letting musicians play on the porch, built a culture around the specific philosophy of slowing down. Then, in 1977, 1 year after Crouch died, Waylon Jennings released a song called Luckenbach, Texas, back to the basics of love. I never visited the place, didn't love the song, recorded it anyway. It went to number 1 and stayed there for 6 weeks, and suddenly Luckenbach wasn't just a hill country curiosity. It was a national idea. Hondo Crouch reportedly said, "Everybody's somebody in Luckenbach," which sounds like a bumper sticker until you're sitting under those pecan trees with a cold beer and you realize you genuinely cannot remember the last time you checked your phone. Luckenbach didn't freeze in the 60s. Someone bought the freeze, declared it a philosophy, and sold the whole country on it. At number 5, Yellville. There are towns that are charming and towns that are just honest. Yellville, Arkansas is the second kind. A small Ozark town that never performed for anyone, never rebuilt itself for tourism, and exists today in almost exactly the same configuration it occupied 6 decades ago. Population, around 1,200 people. Median home price somewhere in the $120,000 to $175,000 range. Strikingly low. Rent around $700 to $900. Cost of living roughly 25 to 35% below national average. Unemployment has historically run above state and national averages. The job market is local, limited, and largely unchanged. Yellville sits in Marion County in the Arkansas Ozarks, genuinely beautiful country, but geographically isolated in a way that kept most external economic pressure from arriving. The timber industry that once anchored the area contracted. Some agriculture remained. Tourism exists around fishing and the Buffalo National River. America's first designated national river runs through the region, but it never transformed Yellville into a destination economy. What was left was the town itself, the courthouse square, the small-town rhythm of people who know each other's histories and don't need to explain themselves because context is already understood. Every October, Yellville hosts the Turkey Trot Festival, a tradition that has included live turkey drops from aircraft, a practice that generated national controversy and legal challenges, and that the town has navigated with the specific stubbornness of a community that does not respond well to outside pressure about local customs. What the textbook skipped is that Yellville isn't trying to be preserved. It isn't trying to be anything for anyone who isn't already from here. That level of self-containment is either authenticity or insularity, depending on where you're standing when you look at it. Living here is genuinely affordable. It's also genuinely limiting if your ambitions outgrow Marion County. Healthcare infrastructure is thin, career paths narrow quickly, young people leave, which is the story of every town like this, and the ones who stay generally made a conscious decision that the place was worth the trade. One longtime resident said something that stuck: "We don't have to market what we are. The people who belong here find it." Whether that's a comfort or a warning depends entirely on who you are. Number 4. Marfa. Marfa is the most complicated entry on this list because it's the one that got famous. And famously, it absorbed that fame without becoming something unrecognizable. Or maybe it did become something unrecognizable and just didn't notice. Population around 1,700 people. Median home price roughly $300,000 to $450,000. Surreal for the middle of the Chihuahuan Desert in far west Texas. Rent starting around $900 and climbing sharply. Cost of living surprisingly high for its size and remoteness. The poverty rate sits around 15%, even as boutique hotels charge $400 a night. That tension is Marfa. The town was founded in the 1880s as a railroad water stop. At its peak in the 1930s and 40s, when the military arrived and built a training base, it held close to 5,000 people. The military left in 1945, and Marfa began a long, slow, quiet decline. By the 1960s, it was a small county seat in the middle of nowhere with a remarkable old courthouse, empty storefronts, and nothing particular going on. Then, in 1973, a minimalist artist named Donald Judd drove out from New York and decided Marfa was where he wanted to make permanent art installations. He bought buildings, he bought land, he brought others. He spent the next 20 years turning an abandoned military base into one of the most significant sites of permanent contemporary art in the world. What the textbooks skipped is that Judd didn't save Marfa by changing it. He saved it by using exactly what it already was: the space, the light, the emptiness, the distance from everything, as the medium. The Marfa lights still appear on the horizon at night, unexplained since the 1880s. The 1956 film Giant was shot here. No Country for Old Men was shot here. The Presidio County Courthouse is still operating in its original 1886 building, and there is still a Prada storefront in the desert, permanently locked, 26 miles outside of town, selling to no one. Living here is beautiful and expensive and logistically challenging in ways the price of a gallery coffee doesn't reveal. Number 3. Madison. There's a town in southeastern Indiana that sits on the Ohio River and looks exactly like 1963 decided to stay. Not because of a disaster, not because of a deliberate preservation effort, and not because anyone planned it. It looks like that because Madison was so aggressively beautiful, so thoroughly built during its 19th century heyday as a river town, that nobody wanted to tear it down, and nobody had enough money to replace it. Population around 11,000 people. Median home price roughly $150,000 to $220,000. Genuinely affordable for the level of architecture you're looking at. Rent around $700 to $950. Cost of living well below national average. Crime rate moderate. Madison's historic downtown is one of the largest contiguous National Historic Landmarks in the United States. That designation was given in 1973, recognizing what had already been true for decades, which is that the entire grid of Madison's Central District had remained almost completely intact since the mid-1800s. The reason is the same reason a lot of these towns survived: geography. Madison is on the Ohio River, which was everything in the early 1800s. Then the railroads went north, not through Madison, and the economic center of Indiana moved elsewhere. The development pressure that would have torn down the 19th century storefronts and replaced them with mid-century concrete never materialized with enough force to do the work. What the textbook skipped is that Madison almost didn't make it. In the mid-20th century, there were real proposals to demolish parts of the historic district for urban renewal. Local residents and advocates fought back, and that fight, which was being replicated in various forms across the country, ended differently here than in a lot of places. Today you can walk a street in Madison And look at federal-style architecture from 1820 next to an operating diner from 1955 and a hardware store that hasn't changed its sign in 40 years. The job market is limited. Healthcare is better than many entries on this list. Cincinnati and Louisville are both within reasonable driving distance. But the economic stagnation that preserved the architecture is also the reason young people leave. One local preservationist said it plainly. "We couldn't afford to ruin it. That's not a compliment. That's just what happened." Madison didn't freeze in the 60s. The 60s came through and, for once, couldn't afford to change what it found. Number 2. Jerome. If you have ever wondered what happens when a copper town loses its entire reason for existing and then gets colonized by people who decide to turn the wreckage into art, Jerome, Arizona is the answer. And it is a genuinely weird answer. Population, around 450 people. Median home price, roughly $350,000 to $500,000. Stunning for a hillside town that by rights should have become rubble. Rent, if you find it, $1,000 to $1,400, mostly because there isn't much of it. Cost of living is deceivingly high for the size. Crime, low. Jerome sits at 5,400 feet on Cleopatra Hill in central Arizona and was, for a period in the early 20th century, called the wickedest town in the West. At its peak, around 15,000 people lived here extracting copper from the Verde Valley. The United Verde mine produced billions of dollars of copper over its lifetime. Hotels, brothels, saloons, a luxury hotel, the infrastructure of a real city, all built on a vertical hillside where buildings had to be dynamited into the cliff face because there was nowhere flat to stand. Then, in 1953, the mine permanently closed. Population fell to under 100 people by the 1960s. Jerome was officially declared a ghost town, and then, again, the artists arrived. What the textbook skipped is the part where Jerome refused to actually become a ghost town. The cheap, dramatic buildings, perched on a cliff over a valley with views that photographers still can't entirely capture, attracted people looking for exactly the kind of strange, elevated, inconvenient beauty that Jerome offered. By the 1970s, a small arts community had taken hold. By the 1980s, the sliding jail, a concrete jail that literally moved 225 feet downhill due to underground mine blasting, was a tourist attraction. Nothing about Jerome is stable. Parts of the town still shift occasionally. The roads tilt. The buildings lean at angles that shouldn't support occupancy. The whole thing is structurally precarious in a way the residents appear to find charming. One long-term Jerome resident said something that gets repeated often enough that it might be official policy. People don't move to Jerome. They end up here. No serious job market. Healthcare is Cottonwood or Prescott. The road up the hill is something you negotiate, not drive. And still, people stay. Jerome didn't freeze in the 60s. It died in the 50s, and the 60s brought it back as something stranger. Number 1, Eureka. Not every town on this list froze because it was abandoned. Not every town froze because artists arrived and decided preservation was the point. Some towns freeze because they were built too well, too thoroughly, too ornately, and by the time the economy moved on, the architecture was too significant to demolish and too expensive to replace. Eureka, California is that town. Population, around 26,000 people, the largest entry on this list. Median home price, roughly $300,000 to $380,000. Rent, around $1,100 to $1,500. Cost of living slightly below the California average, which still makes it expensive by most national standards. Crime higher than most towns on this list. Urban challenges that small towns don't have. Eureka is the county seat of Humboldt County on the Northern California coast. It was founded during the Gold Rush era as a port, the entry point to the Northern California interior. The timber industry followed, and from roughly 1860 through the 1920s, Eureka was one of the most economically active cities on the Pacific coast. Though the wealth built during that period went into Victorian architecture on a scale that is nearly impossible to fully absorb on a first visit. The Carson Mansion, built in 1886 for a lumber baron, is widely considered one of the most ornate Victorian houses in the United States. But the Carson Mansion is not an anomaly. It is the apex of a district where elaborate Victorian commercial buildings and residences fill block after block after block. The timber industry began contracting in the mid-20th century. The economy slowed. And what the textbook skipped is that Eureka never got the wave of urban renewal that reshaped most mid-size American cities in the 1950s and 60s. The money to tear down and rebuild wasn't there. The buildings stayed. The 1960s economic stagnation that would have been a disaster in a different city became, in Eureka, an inadvertent act of historic preservation that would take decades for the outside world to fully appreciate. Today, Eureka's Old Town District is a National Register Historic District. The restaurants and galleries and small businesses that line the Victorian storefronts operate inside buildings that are now between 100 and 150 years old and look, from the outside, almost exactly as they did when they were new. So here's what all 10 of these towns have in common. And it's not what the brochures say. None of them froze on purpose. A highway got rerouted, a mine closed, the money stopped arriving, a military base shut down. Someone bought an almost ghost town for $30,000 and declared it a philosophy. And in each case, what filled the vacuum left by progress wasn't decay. It was just the original thing, still standing, waiting to see if anyone was going to come back for it. Some of these towns found artists, some found retirees, some found travelers on their way somewhere else who pulled over and never quite finished leaving. A few found nobody at all and are still waiting. What the textbook skipped is the simplest version of this story. Not every place that didn't evolve got left behind. Some of them just got left alone. And left alone, it turns out, can look a lot like surviving. Like this video if any part of you is tired of places that never stop reinventing themselves. Subscribe, because the most interesting American history isn't in the museums. It's still in the buildings, still in the streets, still in the towns that didn't make the highway exit. That's it for today. I'll see you in the next forgotten place.